as an ESL teacher, I was trained to focus on language development and not necessarily on content. So science and math related stories are my favorite because they're what I feel is my weakness. I'm not a science teacher, I'm not a math teacher, but I do my best to bring science and math into my classroom. And if you think about science and math topics and themes at the high school level, physical science and biology, they're just so complex. So those stories that are related to that and that the kids can connect to the other learning that they're exposed to in the other classrooms really helps. I use it for daily language practice sometimes when I use the weird news stories. My parrots over here were weird news story about parrots in a Texas backyard. And my student from Honduras spoke up and said, "Oh, I know that bird. This is what we call it." And we began a bilingual discussion of what you call a parrot in the different countries. And it was just a fun way to integrate speaking into our lesson. It's beyond the basics. It integrates the content. As I said, we used a lesson story about a team that discovered a planet and a telescope in space, and the discussion of rockets and rocket fuel and the dimensions of the rocket and of the telescope were just amazing ways to integrate science as well and math. So I found the parrot story and other stories from the weird news to be really, I went to TESOL, and the way they put it in one of the presentations was to humanize our lessons. We get so busy as teachers to just, the lesson has to be perfect. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. Okay, I'm going to use this strategy and I'm going to pull out all my bag of tricks, but we really have to connect with students. And I feel like post-COVID, that's more important than ever because kids are so disconnected from their education right now. So 3 of my favorite past lessons and strategies that I talked about or used in the classroom were learning about Mexican culture through tacos. Now, I jumped into this because I have a Vietnamese boy who, and this was my upper level advanced group. The Vietnamese boy, he thinks so deeply. I can't even wrap my brain around some of the thoughts that he shares with me, that he just takes a concept and just takes it so deep and so in another dimension almost. And so this Mexican culture through tacos talked about cultural appreciation versus appropriation. And so we bounced from the podcast to websites that discussed cultural appreciation versus appropriation. And I took the questions off of the screen and printed them out and put them on sentence strips and created some sentence frames so that the students could read the questions, think about the questions, frame their answers. I even had to, because the topic was so deep, to challenge my Vietnamese boy and engage him in the learning. That I had to front load the questions. And so the day before, we listened to the podcast, we talked about the vocabulary, we talked about briefly cultural appreciation versus appropriation, and I introduced the questions for the next day's discussion. And so front loading that material gave them a chance to really think about, because many of the students couldn't even, they were having difficulty explaining what their culture even was. I think so many times culture is such a part of us that we can't identify. We can't isolate it. It's too much of a part of who we are. So they were having a hard time expressing themselves. The biggest space telescope, and the team discovers the planet. The kids loved drawing out the dimensions of the space telescope, as I said, and talking about the planet and where it was in relation to other things in the galaxy. And the Grand Canyon love notes, I really thought that the kids would enjoy the discussion of the love notes, but we really jumped into a discussion and further research into the Grand Canyon and how it was formed and landforms. And so the main topic of the podcast really didn't happen to be the main topic of our lesson.